Thanks very much. Can you hear me okay? Am I shouting right in your earlugs? No, good. Okay, I'll keep it about this level. My name's Sarah Wajid and I'm the Co-Chief Executive of Birmingham Museums Trust. Thank you very much for coming to this session. Time is tight, so I'm going to get straight stuck into it and introduce the panellists really briefly and then on to the first question. We've got 5 minutes for questions at the end. This is a 40-minute session with just 5 minutes for questions because there's so much to talk about. So I just quickly want to say it's Esme Ward, Director of Manchester Museum, Stephen Bush, Associate Editor, Financial Times, Keith Merrin, Director of North East Museums, John Finch, Director of Barnsley Museums and Chair of the English Civic Museums Network, and we're here to talk about the future of civic museums. So if you're not here for that, you're in the wrong place, move along. So it's a bit gloomy, it's a bit grim. I'm just going to give you a little bit of an overview of where things are at with civic museums and before going to my first question. So in 2024, Arts Council identified 413 local authority reliant museums, which account for about a third of all accredited museums in England. And they primarily serve local and regional audiences and have a key role in placemaking, identity and regeneration. And these museums in particular tend to have significant but expensive infrastructure, often in heritage buildings that are really expensive to maintain and have a really wide and diverse set of collections. The things to note are that primary public funding is down big time, commercial income is down, audiences are about down 20% across the sector on pre-pandemic levels, and spend per visitor is down. Reserves, financial reserves are down. Costs are up. Costs are up about 12% in the same period that local authority funding has reduced by 37%. So that's a total swing of 50% worse off since 2010. The depth of the crisis is more serious than we have ever seen. So that's all the bad news, that's all the gloom and the doom to get you right in the mood to talk about the grim dystopian future for civic museums. So I want to lift that gloom a little bit by starting to ask our panellists what experience have they had recently in a museum that has sparked joy for them personally. I'm going to start with you, Stephen.
So I'm going to go for a crowd-pleasing answer because it's a museum run by the person next to me, which is I had a really lovely experience last time I was in Manchester. A friend cancelled, so I had a nice slot in the evening, and I love doing a museum in the evening because I love museums, but I'm kind of phobic of other people's children. And just had a wonderful time looking around the new exhibition about the Chinese diaspora in Manchester and the wonderfully spooky, because it was at night, stuffed animals on the second floor. I just had a magical time, and a really nice volunteer told me a lot of really interesting stuff about the Egyptology section. Yeah, it was just a wonderful, magical, unexpected evening.
Brilliant, thank you. Obviously, Esme, you can't say that.
No, and I promise I didn't pay him. I actually, I'm so pleased just to say we're starting with a bit of joy, because it really matters to hold on to the joy. I want to talk about a fabulous civic museum. So we're actually a university museum that has a civic role, but Manchester Art Gallery. So fairly recently I went in and they've got new work, Florence Caxton's Woman's Work, and I'm stood watching this next to Ford Madox Brown's very famous Pre-Raphaelite painting of work, and then there's this little woman's work, and basically it's putting a bit of a this up to the patriarchy. It's done in 1861 by this female artist. I'm looking at it, smiling at the way male conventions are being unpicked, and there's this woman to the side of me, a bit older than me, and she just looked at me and she went, "It's bloody great, innit?" And I loved it because it was like a moment of connection in the city of suffragettes to this work. It was a tiny moment, but utterly joyous.
Nice one, thank you. Keith?
Yeah, I'm going to cheat by going for one of my own museums.
Shameless.
You will all be aware, of course, that Newcastle recently won the Carabao Cup. That's football, for those of you who don't know. And so unexpected was this moment that nobody had planned for what you would do should such a thing happen. And a hastily arranged bus parade was organised, and two of our museums were actually on the bus parade route, and very quickly we pulled together, first of all, an exhibition of old football stuff that we had from previous cup wins some 50-60 years ago, but also a collaboration with a voluntary run fans group who make these massive flags, and we were able to fly flags from our museums, trails for kids. We kept the museums open late and they were absolutely rammed, full of football fans, and it was absolutely brilliant and joyous experience.
Perfect.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Like Keith, I'm shamelessly going to do one of my own museums as well. And last week I was lucky enough to participate in our Feels Like Home group at Experience Barnsley in the town centre in Barnsley. And that is a group of migrants in Barnsley. And the museum's been running that group for the last 7 years. And the joy, enthusiasm and inspiration amongst that group of 100 people who've come to Barnsley from across the world, and the way that they were using the town museum as a way of coming together to share stories, but also to learn about the place they'd come to, again, just filled me with joy and again demonstrated the wonderful role that civic museums can play.
Brilliant. So even through that little roll call and kind of summoning to mind experiences of visitors and power of museums and regional and civic museums, we can feel the potential, we can feel what they're for, we know what they're for. But the situation is really, really very challenging at this point. And given the economic climate, given the fact that Labour's in its first term, and that we are hearing rumours about DCMS perhaps even being dismantled, things in terms of culture, in terms of the wider priorities, culture doesn't feel very high up in the wider world. And of course, we will all say, museum directors here, that that's absolute travesty and it shouldn't be that way, and we must punch to get further up and hear and be, our voices must be louder. But I want to ask you, Stephen, because you are not a museum director and you do not spend all of your time thinking about museum sector finances, about where museums or culture even sits in the wider world in the priorities of the current government from where you're sitting.
Well, and I don't think this is going to come as a galloping shock or a source of joy to anyone in the audience. Obviously quite low down, right? You have a Secretary of State who clearly regards the post as some kind of punishment beating, seems at best uninterested in large swathes of it. And although I wouldn't put much credence in the breakup idea, that DCMS is going through its comprehensive spending review negotiations right now, and breaking up the department is not being costed as of yet. I think it is a safe assumption that the department, you will have a different Secretary of State by the autumn. But the very fact that you've had for the first 9 months a Secretary of State who you worry might struggle to name the museums in the Wigan area, let alone the wider country, I think does show how low down the priority list that the department is with the government as a whole. The one sort of consolation I would say is that lots of the cabinet are in that generation of children who were gifted and talented under the last Labour government, so they had museum trips and aim higher, so for them they have a huge personal affection for the museum sector. So I think it is likely that the museum sector will get a more engaged Secretary of State in the autumn, but I'm aware that is a little bit, how could you have a less engaged Secretary of State than you have now?
Interesting. Right, I'm going to move straight on to you, John, and ask you to talk about the fact of the renewal fund. For those of you who don't know, the English Civic Museums Network lobbied together with all of the other museum agencies really hard to get this crisis money out of government, out of central government, to create a fund that is particularly to help civic museums in real crisis of closing. And after a lot of hard work and a lot of collaboration, we got it. Props to John as chair of English Civic Museums, as one of the key movers in all of that. And now a moment for you to gloat about that, John. No, a moment for you to talk about lessons learned and any reflections you want to share on the campaign to get that renewal fund.
Thank you, Sarah. And I think we should spend some time just savouring the fact that we did get £20 million out of government dedicated to improve the lot of civic museums from Penrith down to Penzance. That's a huge step forward. I think there are very, very many positive things we should take note of the campaign that we undertook over the last 12 or 18 months. The Civic Museums Network, and there's more than 80 museum services across the country who are part of it, came together. And I think what we agreed was that we needed to focus on our small number of key issues. Perhaps in the past we'd provided a blizzard of thoughts to Arts Council, DCMS and ministers in terms of what we needed. We agreed a small number of 2 or 3 key asks. We came together, we agreed that, we committed to communicating that succinctly and effectively, regularly, over a period of time, to the previous government as they came to the end of their tenure, and then to the new government when they took power last July. And we used the power of mailboxes. We then, each of our civic museums are obviously in MPs' constituencies. We have leaders of councils, we have chairs of boards who we ask to write to the Secretary of State and the Minister with a consistent message about needing resource, about willing to work with government, about improving the lot of civic museums, and about the fact that we were, as a sector, prepared to change. We recognise that we need to think differently about how museums are delivered, the communities we engage with, the collections that we have. And so that was consistently communicated over a period of months, if not years. It took some time, but we succeeded. And then, as you're aware, in February, we got the announcement. Now, in terms of challenges, that money is for this year, this financial year, and that's very welcome. We'll do a huge amount of good, but as we know, civic museums, the challenges will continue into next year and beyond. So we're continuing to have those conversations with government. But as Stephen said, sometimes those conversations with ministers can be a little challenging. I think to a degree they may have thought that the problem's now solved by the £20 million investment, and that further dialogue is not necessarily needed. So we need to continue the campaign, continue the lobbying, continuing the consistent conversations that we're having with government as we move into the future.
Thanks, John. As you say, the problems are still there. We've got the renewal fund, but it really is just a drop in the ocean and for crisis, to address crises. And regional funding disparities are worse in this country than they were in the 1970s. We're sitting here in London, in the capital, to have this conversation, to reach these ears. Often we have to go to Parliament or have meetings or go to schmoozes in London because that's where the power base is. But regional disparities are also a lot worse in this country than they are in our nearest comparable European neighbours. And given how things are in the economy and how they have been after a long period of austerity, people might argue, or just say this is the reality, that any local authority funded culture that is stuck behind that local authority paywall is essentially doomed to shrinkage, and that rationalisations and closures are inevitable, and to some extent we have to just take it. What would you say to that, Keith? And then I'm going to come to you, Esme.
Yeah, I mean, as you know, I'm quite an optimistic person, and so I'm kind of seeing a lot of the positives that John's talked about. I mean, absolutely, just first of all to say, being based up in the northeast of England, you really feel that regional disparity. You really, the fact that I'm in London 4 days this week out of 5 for various conversations, actually 5 days out of 5, for various conversations with different people, kind of reinforces exactly what you're saying. Having said that, I do think there are some things we should hang on to. The work that John and others did around the last spending review really focused in on the value that we provide within local communities. It was very, very clear about joining the dots between what we do every day, those of us who work in museums, and how that benefits the economy, how that supports community well-being, how that breaks down barriers caused by inequality, how that supports people in the way that they deal with climate crisis. So just being really specific in how that reaches the missions. And again, just picking up what Stephen said there, I was with the schools minister yesterday, who is, on a personal level, so dedicated to museums, brought our kids to my museums, and that kind of really chimed with me when you were saying that. So I think there are some positives. It kind of feels at the moment there's a bit like hanging in. It feels like, what can we do to hang in there? Just, if I can, one last thing I should say, and again, many of you may be aware of this, but one of the things that makes our museums different in the Northeast is that we deliver services for 5 local authorities, and very recently the 5th one of those, Northumberland, joined into the Northeast Museums Group, and I think we will see more of that coming down the line, more of shared services, more of how we can collaborate to deliver more effective services across county lines, if you like.
Thank you. I think Esme's got her own mic.
Yeah, so I was going to talk a bit about change and evolution, as Keith mentioned, but I do just want to go back to that moment when, for me, I've worked in museums now nearly 30 years. I have never seen consensus like it. At the time I was sitting on the National Museum Directors Council, essentially everything else was off the table. It was moving to crisis and campaign mode. If you care about museums, and I run a university museum, you care about civic museums. They're part of the ecology. And I think if nothing else, it's given a really clear sense of our collective understanding of that ecology and what we need to do. And I do think it's useful for us to think about it as campaign mode. So 20 million, fantastic. Nowhere bloody near enough, frankly, just got started. And I think if we can unlock the potential, so it isn't just museum directors, museum colleagues, volunteers, it's unlocking all of our visitors. Between us, how many visitors do we get who care about this? When we look at the museums that have been at real risk and threat of closure, what's made the difference? It's people. It's people fighting for them. And I think you all know your audiences, your visitors, those conversations with them, and whether they're really advocating as powerfully and as effectively in that messaging is really critical. But I do think also evolution and change needs to happen, and it's been happening from day one in museums since they first opened their doors. And more partnerships, more collaborations, more shared roles, I think that's going to be a really good thing. The main bit is, I don't know about anybody else, but I want to feel a sense of agency. The worst thing is like change happening to you and you've got no sense of agency. So I think anything we can do collectively to hold on to that.
Thank you. One of the changes we have been looking at is how museums can learn to talk about how museums contribute to economic growth and speak to government priorities. I have really mixed feelings myself about this narrative, because I feel leaning too hard into the argument that museums can contribute to economic growth and that they should risks detracting from the moral and artistic argument about actually the cultural value of museums. But I would be interested in what your take is on that, Stephen.
Yeah, so it's a double-edged sword, because it's obviously true that in most places with a civic museum, the loss of it would be truly catastrophic for the local economy, because it's the reason people come into the city centre, full stop. However, it's also ultimately not, it's not a very good, look how well the argument's working for universities right now. The other thing I would say, and I'm not going to pretend I have a solution to this problem, but the risk with making every argument for your future about the political priorities of the central government is many of you from last week now have a party called Reform whose financial obligations are essentially social care with a civic museum partially attached. And what they see as the political role and function of museums is going to be very, very difficult for you all to navigate at the same time as trying to get central government not to forget about you and not to leave you behind. Again, I'm not going to pretend that I have a solution to talking to Labour ministers in the language of their missions and their priorities and the ways many of them do see museums as a tool of social justice, and navigating the challenge of having local authorities run by people who believe it's a tool of sort of national destroying woke to even talk about where your exhibits come from. But that is a huge challenge for the sector, and again, I'm not going to pretend that I have an easy answer for it, I'm afraid.
Well, as you've gone there, let's go there. I was going to leave this question for if we had time, but given what we've seen with how the Trump administration in the US is cracking down and limiting freedom of speech for museums over there, what you said about recent election results and Reform taking more of the vote share in the country, as is consistent with what we see in Europe, what agency does local museums and regional museums have in promoting democracy? And I feel, John, that you want to talk about that because things have changed in Barnsley.
Thanks, Sarah.
And maybe cover devolution while you're at it, because we haven't got much time.
All in 2 minutes.
Cheers.
I think, as Stephen's touched on and Sarah have touched on, we need to be alive to the political situation that we're facing. In Barnsley, our next door neighbours, Doncaster, went Reform during last week's elections. Barnsley has full elections coming up next May, and the administration is very concerned about what the situation may be as we move forward. And so I think we need to be mindful of that. But I think going back to Sarah's original point around the role of museums in a borough like Barnsley, the role of museums, I think, and this will resonate, I think, with all political parties, is to tell people stories and is to benefit the lives of people. Now, in a borough like Barnsley, where we have unfortunately the lowest life expectancy for women in the country, we have a range of other societal challenges, we can see the huge benefits that our museums play in terms of public health, in terms of skills development, in terms of community engagement, in terms of community cohesion, and at a very simple level, in terms of celebrating the heritage of a locality and ensuring that stories are told from right across the borough. And I think we have to focus on that. It is not our role to be political. It is our role to work with our communities and to celebrate stories.
Thank you. Did you want to say anything else?
And do you want me to move seamlessly on to devolution?
Yeah, go on.
Because I think devolution is seen by many as a challenge, a threat. But I think we do need to see it as an opportunity as we move forward. As Keith's already mentioned, we need to look at new models of governance, new business models for our museums, new ways of securing funding. And the changes that devolution will bring about at regional, sub-regional and local level will give us the opportunity to have the conversation about what role museums and culture more generally can play in the delivery of place agendas, in the delivery of localities. So I think it's seeing that as an opportunity over the coming months and years.
Thank you. Keith or Esme, and in fact, or Stephen, who would like to come in on sort of democracy/devolution next?
Yeah, I wanted to just bring something into the room that might, I hope, be useful. I don't know. We're a university museum, and one of the things we've been exploring, and actually tomorrow we have our University Museums Group conference, which in the context of an HE crisis is about innovation and renewal. Sound familiar? But actually the Bennett policy and the Higher Education Academy just brought out a really interesting paper about valuing and understanding social and cultural infrastructure. And I think it's really good because actually it's speaking absolutely to museums and understanding themselves as a clear part of a much broader social and cultural infrastructure. And as someone who several years ago was seconded to Andy Burnham's team when he first started, I went and I embedded arts and culture within the population health plan. I absolutely can see the potential in devolution, but my but is, you know what, you've got to have a lot of flex. So there are going to be things that suddenly become a major priority. In my world, nighttime economy. Greater Manchester, we're doing so much work around nighttime economy. Where are we fitting in that? And so my concern is that fundamental commitment to museums across all of their work, across all those communities and audiences. You've really got to have that absolutely nailed, because otherwise the potential to be at the whim of the current focus for economic growth or whatever it might be, you've got to make the case on all of those scores.
Thank you. Stephen, before I readjust here, did you have anything on democracy, museums, irrelevant?
Well, I think it's important that you don't allow yourself to end up being caught in the crossfire between local government that is increasingly going to be dominated, as it always is when one party is in power, by opponents of the central government and vice versa. I think devolution is a huge opportunity for civic museums, but ultimately what changed in the 1970s is we went from having very strong local government to very weak local government, and now we have local government which is overwhelmingly a list of statutory responsibilities. The thing that is in the long-term interest of civic and cultural life throughout this country is to get back to having stronger local government that isn't just a social care function with some legacies of municipal socialism than it sort of is too proud to scrap but is too poor to maintain properly.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, I know, having spoken to the leader at Newcastle City Council, for example, those traditional Labour authorities are very hopeful that central government will do something to restore more power to local government, really as a defensive mechanism, if you like. I mean, I'm certainly no political expert, Stephen, I don't know about you, but this idea that actually if people see more coming out of local services, then they're less likely to vote, those parties out of power. So again, I'm quite optimistic in that. The shift that's happened to the right may actually ultimately be beneficial for local authorities.
Okay, as we're taking a more optimistic turn in the conversation, let's turn our minds to solutions. What are the biggest levers that we can pull as leaders, as allies of the museum sector, as visitors? What is it for you, John? What's the next step for English Civic Museums campaign?
I think going back to something that Esme said a few minutes ago, Sarah, which is this the way that the museum ecology came together to talk about the hugely critical role of civic museums in particular in delivering museum services across the country is building on that. We were able to speak with one voice for the first time, certainly in my over 30 years of working in the sector. Obviously, I started as a young boy. But I think we need to continue that, and that means museum professionals from all walks of life, from all types of museums, working together to celebrate the role that civic museums play, that national museums play, that university museums play, that independent museums play in the fabric of civic life throughout our communities. Focusing on that, leading up to the next spending review, but in the long term as well. And then I think we can truly make a difference.
Thank you. Esme?
I've got a couple of things. So I've got something interesting, which isn't quite working for us yet, but I'm holding on to hope. So Manchester's the first city to have done a kind of a city visitor charge, so £1 per room. And that last year that raised, I've got the figure here, 2.8 million, a large proportion of which goes into culture. The Whitworth's Current Turner show, a large part of that show is funded directly by that tax. So that's just one. More of that would be good, not just in Manchester, everywhere. And I suppose the other bit is collective endeavour, actually, and not undermining it. And I think the thing that's really hard in all of this is holding on to the hope and the ambition and trying things. And yet we know that when we try things, small things, they grow, they evolve, and when they respond to needs. So I'm going to give a quick story as an example. We have an incredible charity on our top floor. Our top floor is open. It's co-working for 18 charities who live in the museum, and they use the museum for their work. And one of the charities is called Pink. They work with neurodivergent young people. 5 years ago, we piloted something with them, whether the museum was a good, kind of like a campus, a school. We registered as a college as well as a museum. We're now the headquarters. They now run 18 of these different campuses and colleges all over, and that emerged from a conversation between an incredible member of my learning team, Barina Rashid, and the woman from Pink about the state of neurodivergent education in Manchester and whether we could do something. So I think we've got to believe in our potential and our partnerships, and then we've got to just sort of throw things at it. Keep playing, keep trying.
Thank you. Keith?
Yeah, I mean, I think Esme's just kind of brilliantly made the point that I was going to make, is that I don't think we can just keep doing what we've always done and expect people to chuck money at us and to sort it out. You know, we've got to keep innovating, keep changing. I mean, you know, we've talked a lot about funding, you know, which is kind of something that sits in our mind. But that point about audiences not returning in the numbers pre-COVID, you all know this, but audience behaviour has changed dramatically. It changed dramatically in the pandemic. It's changed again since. There are big changes, and yet we still, you know, plough on with our mode of delivery, our same opening hours, the same stuff we've always done. We've got to actually be a bit more agile. And that's kind of my story about football at the start, was about, actually, if we put our minds to it, we can actually change things, we can be agile, we can change the opening hours, we can fit what people want. We can't just sit there and think, well, yeah, we've always been here, and therefore you should chuck some money at us. So I'm all for more collaborations, more change, more innovation.
Thank you. Before I come to questions, can I ask you, Stephen, what sort of single biggest bit of advice have you got for the four of us?
I think what museums have got to do, and I'm aware, given how much of my trade writes about you, this is a bit like going, stop hitting yourself, but you've got to find ways of becoming a positive case study. Often it feels that the only time that people notice a museum in the paper and in discourse is when it does something controversial, when actually there are loads of really interesting stories about what museums are doing and what it says about how we've changed since the pandemic, etc., where I think museums should be being more proactive about going, hey, if you want to write about the pandemic and how we've changed, here's an interesting thing that is relevant to us. Otherwise, you just end up always being a culture wars football, which is really not where you want to be.
Thank you.
If only you could tell some of your colleagues in the media that would be really helpful.
Should we open it up to questions, and then we'd just like 2 minutes at the end to round up after the questions, if that's okay?
Okay, right. Can we have any questions from the floor, please, or any observations? Can we put the mic up really close, and can you be patient with the panel, because I've just stolen one of their mics, so they've only got one between the whole panel.
Yeah, hello. I'm Ben Travers from Museum Development London. To what extent is the membership of the Civic Museums Group, I mean, is there also a good representation from smaller and medium-sized local authorities within the group?
Keith, sorry to give me the mic there. Ben, that's a good question. Yes, there are. There's a good number of smaller services. We do have, as I've mentioned, over 80, and they vary from the very large authorities like Birmingham and the newly named North East Museums organisation, to mid-sized organisations like Barnsley, to a range of very small borough councils like Lancaster, and a range in the southeast as well. So we're trying. What we've noticed, I think, Ben, is that a lot of those smaller services have struggled to put their head above the parapet, because they're small. They're often very small staffing numbers. So we're trying to speak on their behalf, because we appreciate that often they are just running to survive.
No question.
Any other panel members want to chip in, or go on to the next question?
I think that was well answered,
Okay,
well covered.
Good. Any other? Yes, one there, and then one down there.
Hi guys, I'm Alistair Brown from the National Lottery Heritage Fund. Thanks for a really interesting panel. We talked a lot about public funding, but there's also been lots of pushes over the years from central government, from other agencies, towards seeking philanthropic sources, towards generating own income. I just wondered if you could reflect a bit on your experiences from local authority funded or local authority run organisations, how that has been, what have been the pros and cons of that.
It's me?
So,
You? Okay.
shall I go first?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think the north-south divide thing kicks in quite well here. Successive governments have told us that philanthropy is the answer to all our problems as museums. In the northeast of England, that is not a big thing. There are not many philanthropists. I also think the nature of philanthropy has changed quite a lot. So I mentioned that I was with the schools minister yesterday. That was at the launch of a thing called Time Odyssey, which is absolutely brilliant, I should say, and Esme's museum and a couple of my museums are involved in that. It's funded entirely through philanthropy, but it's quite prescriptive in what the philanthropist who just gives you some money to do what you want to do doesn't seem to be such a thing anymore. So there's much more of a prescriptive nature. I've got a great idea, you can help deliver it. And it is a good idea, don't get me wrong, it's a great thing. And I was standing up yesterday promoting it, so I've got to say that. I should say, and actually in the introduction, Sarah said, income's down and all that. I should say, for us, it's not. We're doing really well, actually, in terms of our earned income is really much higher than it has been before. Our fundraised income is higher than we've ever achieved before. The problem is that our costs just go up and up and up. So the more money we generate, we just never catch up, because our public funding is completely flatlining at best. So, I kind of feel, and I'd throw this back to you, Alistair, there's a succession of things, and the Museum Renewal Fund's another one. Heritage Fund does this a lot. There's always resilience money. There's some money, because magically, if we spend 50 grand in 3 months, it's going to solve all our problems. And actually, I'm not convinced that it's that helpful to be chucking these little bits of resilience money all the time at the sector, rather than having a complete rethink of how the sector's funded, full stop.
Thank you.
So just on that, it's bloody hard work, frankly. And I say that with a museum that went through a big capital project, and we have got people, this is all about building relationships, and put a huge amount of time and energy into those relationships, and they have borne fruit, and we are massively grateful, and those people are wonderful, and once we've got hold of them, I ain't ever letting them go. But it's, in a way, that capital project allowed us to be a bit more strategic, which is what I think Keith is talking about. about 10 years ago, this is relevant, I promise, I went to San Francisco, lucky me, but not to actually look at the smaller museums and arts organisations. So not the SF MoMAs, not the ones who basically all the money that was coming in to San Francisco at that time. And they did this really interesting thing. They just said, we decided we just really needed to get ourselves together. And so all of the smaller arts organisations all clubbed together. They had somebody that they paid to just share with them all of the businesses, companies, philanthropists with CSR that aligned with their particular arts organisation or museum, and that they could then build a relationship with. This takes massive amounts of work and time and energy, and when you are trying to literally keep the doors open and the lights on, who has the time for that? And I think just having some funding that enables museums to come together to start to do this work together has got to be at least a better start, because otherwise it's only going to be museums of a certain size, and with that gap is widening ever faster.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more question.
Yeah. We have one question which is literally from the floor now.
Thank you so much. Are you guys able to hear me?
Yeah,
A little bit more? Is that better? Okay. Okay, so my question for you guys is, one, thank you so much for coming and speaking with all of us. My name is Zoe. I'm a master's student at the UCL Museums and Galleries and Education program. And the question I have for you guys is kind of actually going back to politics and looking at kind of the difference between lowercase p politics and capital case P politics, and kind of looking at how politics happen to people. And what a big move is in museums right now, as I see it on every museum website, we are a safe space for everybody, for all people. How do you guys grapple with the fact that a lot of the times, politics, are museums able to take a political stance in the way that some political parties may be more willing to look at the importance of diversity and culture, and others may not? Are museums able to take a capital P political stance on this?
Oh, I love that question.
But then you should take it.
Can I get stuck in? First of all, I don't believe museums are safe spaces. I think that's rubbish. Sorry. I hope we're brave spaces, but for many people, we are definitely not safe spaces. And just on the political, small p for a minute, we are deeply political places. Of course we are. I mean, I'm literally in a museum that was part of colonial machinery and infrastructure. You can't get much more political than that. But the thing is, our role isn't to tell people what to think. It's to equip them to navigate our world. And if we can be really clear about what we stand for and the values that drive us, that's very, very different. So for me, absolutely, I want us to be a place where you feel you belong, and we will work and do everything to try and make that possible. But the how we do that involves those people in helping shape those experiences and not making assumptions about what people need.
Okay, on that note, because we kind of have to wrap up, I'm going to just say a few words to try and pull this together and to shamelessly talk about something at Birmingham Museums Trust that gives me hope, which is that we've been talking about democracy, we've been talking about changing and doing things differently, and we've also been talking about galvanising and campaigning for our sector as a whole, and engaging with our communities and mobilising the people that we serve, helping to mobilise them to make this campaign, because if they don't care if their museum's closed down because it's irrelevant to them, then actually that's what politicians care about, that's what voters care about. And at Birmingham Museums Trust, we've run a citizens' jury to sort of essentially decide and underpin the future of the museum. It underpins our next 5-year plan, funded by Heritage Lottery Fund. Thanks very much, Lottery. And that's been an absolute revelation for me as a museum director for the last 4.5 years, working under a council that has actually declared bankruptcy with the Section 114 and running essentially a massive museum service, 9 museums, most of which have been closed most of the time for the last 4.5 years. We've only just about able to get Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery reopened, recently, most of it. But the citizens' jury to hear from people who mainly found the museums irrelevant to their lives or were barely aware of them. This is a sort of small demos, a democratically representative group of 30 people who represent the people of Birmingham, came together over 2 months to deliberate and understand everything from our finances to our governance structure and give us a series of recommendations about what this thing is for and what it should be for in the future and what it should do for the people of Birmingham. And I saw such an absolute swell of kind of pride in their place and an absolute thirst for democratic involvement. One of them said at the end of the process, I feel like a citizen for the first time in decades. And that's not about the museum. That's about having a voice and coming together with other people to actually deliberate and make decisions about something that matters to them and is infrastructure for their people, for their young people, for their future, for their city where they live. And giving that voice, or opening up that voice and putting them in front of politicians, is one of the key things that I think that we can do. And also to look across the whole piece at how the infrastructure of civic museums, which is, when you think about the whole of England and all of the audiences we serve, together we represent a massive piece of infrastructure that has incredible potential in terms of all of those agendas like levelling up but without all of the governmental jargon and all the bureaucratic stuff, the stuff we care about, trying to make society more equal, more enriched. Collectively, civic museums represent this incredible spine across the country and could be a huge force for change and enabling a lot of these incredible social outcomes. But we almost have to see it like that, like an army of civic museums all over the country, and with an army of citizens' juries. And on that note, I'm going to pull it to a close. Thank all these incredible brain boxes and leaders and thinkers for this really rich conversation.
A big hand, please. A big hand.